Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Catalano, president of the NACD Texas TriCities chapter. I'm pleased to welcome you to a very timely discussion today on cybersecurity threats and trends. I'd like to first thank Manuel Delgado, who is my fearless co-lead in designing this program. Before we get started, I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors for their continued support of NACD and for their contribution to quality programming content. They are all true and valued partners of our chapter. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to our new members and to those attending for the first time. Thanks so much for joining us. We look forward to engaging with you at both our virtual and in-person programs in the future. Speaking of the latter, we hope that you can join us in person in Houston on April 19th for what promises to be a wonderful conversation with Secretary James A. Baker. But back to today, we have a fantastic program. The topic of cybersecurity is one that we regularly have on our NACD programming lineup. Over the last 2 decades, there's probably been no topic that has evolved so much as this one, mainly because of the impact of technology and the speed at which nefarious players have learned to breach the systems that control our information and processes. With the backdrop of Putin's war in the Ukraine, this program is timely, as we know of the increase in nation-state involvement in security breaches. For our members today, please be reminded that NACD offers a certificate in cyber risk oversight to better equip us as directors in the boardroom on this important topic. I've asked Becky to post a link in the chat if you'd like to learn more. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Matt Hartzell, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Matt is the Chief Administrative Officer for Smith & Associates, an international distributor of semiconductors, and is also on the board of Allegiance Bankshares. He has chaired multiple IT committees and is on the ERM committee for Allegiance. We always like to include a factoid about our speakers. In his free time, Matt is pretty unambitious, doing 100-mile bicycle rides across Texas. Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Anna. I'm sitting and resting now, so all's well. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, as the case may be. This is a very timely topic in uncertain times. Most of us don't understand the intricacies of today's automobiles, but we drive them, we handle them daily, we live with them. Very precious few of us know anything about the details of the IT software and architectures and policies that protect us and our institutions on whose boards we sit. Now, the analogy breaks down as I'll do, because while we may have thieves and we may have carjackers out there in our automobiles, there are not whole nation states out working, planning harm on an existential level to our institutions, to our companies, to our infrastructure in this company. So I'm passionate about this topic, always have been. This is something, look, to quote my hero of the year, President Zelensky of Ukraine, we don't need a ride out of here, we need ammunition, right? So here to provide you some of the ammunition we need to consider today are 3 very talented, very well experienced speakers, Joanna Berkey, Joe Bagnall, and Kristen Lane. Joanna is the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO at HP. She has responsibility for HP's global cybersecurity program, including infrastructure, technology, platforms, and business units. Joanna is also an independent director at Reliability Force Corporation, whose mission is to ensure that the electric grid in the Great Lakes and the Mid-Atlantic region stays protected. She's a member of the California-Israel Chamber of Commerce Cybersecurity Board and holds an NACD directorship certification. She has a computer science mathematics background from the University of Texas at Austin and Angelo State University, and has spent her career in cybersecurity. So welcome, Joanna. Joel Bagnall is a senior executive and global cybersecurity and risk management expert whose experience includes over 3 years at the White House and 7 years as advisor to the President of the United States on Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, including cybersecurity. His senior executive and cybersecurity leadership positions include stints with Dedica, BAE Systems, and L3Harris Technologies, among others. He is currently Chief Strategy Officer with Exodus Intelligence, a cybersecurity company that provides early warning and vulnerability intelligence to customers about the most serious threats. Joel is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a combat veteran serving in the U.S. Army over 20 years. Welcome, Joel, and thank you. Kristen Lane is a senior intelligence analyst with the FBI's Cyber Division. Since 2008, she's provided technical and strategic analysis on national security and criminal cyber matters originating from Asia. She has supported nearly every public indictment of Chinese cyber actors, and she provides support to FBI and US government cyber-related policy efforts. Intelligence analyst Lane regularly collaborates with multiple US federal agencies and military organizations, as well as with foreign partners, representing the FBI, working with others to combat the cyber threat. Kristen has a Master of Science in Information Technology from Carnegie Mellon University and a Bachelor of Science from Allegheny College. Welcome, Kristen. Thank you. So let's start with Joanna. How do we begin? Where does a board member not steeped in IT, not its language, not its operations, how do they begin to ask questions about the cyber risk facing us?
Fundamentally, cybersecurity risk is just that, risk. No more and no less, really. And, and everyone would be pardoned for thinking that it's this strange beast because there's so much verbiage around it, so much technical detail when you hear people talk about it. And, arguably, I think due to the origins of the domain, very technical, very embedded, either in the military or deep in IT departments, it for years now has really been talked about and thought about as a technical domain and a technical problem. There's this technical problem going on. We're all hearing about it. So let's find enough smart people and let's throw enough money at it. And this technical problem will be fixed and we can all move on with business as usual. I don't think I'm overstating things by saying that really has been the mindset for years and still is in many places. Over the last, and really digital transformations pushed an evolution in that awareness, because you could no longer really just look at cyber and say, oh, it's a technical problem, and if you work hard enough, you can fix it. Cyber risk touches almost everything now. And, going from being a technical silo to really being thought of as a strategic horizontal is the evolution that we've seen in the field. And I intentionally don't even say a strategic horizontal risk because it can be both a risk and an opportunity for companies. Today, we're primarily going to focus on talking about it as a risk and how we get our hands around that. But I think, that way of thinking about it, think of it as just another business touching horizontal is a really great way to start. And think of it as what it really is that I mentioned at the beginning. It is a risk. Companies and boards have been dealing with risk for decades. So the same questions you would have about financial risk, or the same questions you would have about doing business in an emerging market, these are the same sorts of questions you want to ask about your enterprise's cyber risk. How do they assess it? How are they prioritizing it? How are they mitigating the aspects of it that rise to the top of the priority list? Even if you don't know the guts and the ins and outs of cybersecurity, you'll know through their answers if you can have a comfort level in how your enterprise's management and executives are thinking about the cyber risk. And we can always tell when someone is really confident in what they're saying and when they're kind of spinning you a little bit of a line. You can detect that even if you don't know all the details about cyber. And, two really tangible takeaways here that I would recommend to any board member and anyone who is designing a cybersecurity strategy is, number one, are they being prepared? Most people say now it's not a matter of if, but when. Sadly, I think that is true. And it absolutely is how the designers of a cyber strategy need to think about it. So on the board, ask what the preparedness is. Are they running tabletops? Are you as a board member involved in strategic senior executive level tabletops? Do you believe that the senior execs at your enterprise know their role in the case of a cyber breach? Do you as a board member know your role? Would you be expected to have a role if a breach occurred? These preparedness and situational awareness questions are, I think, really great way for someone who doesn't know a lot about the topic to start to get some knowledge about how my enterprise is thinking about this, and do I think they're thinking about the right things? In addition to the preparedness, I want to mention third-party validation is a huge tool here. Just like financial risk and just like third-party auditors, third-party auditing and validation is a great way for a non-domain expert to get a comfort level, get more knowledge, get some reassurance, maybe not get a comfort level, and then know that, hey, we've got some things to dive into. As a practicing CISO, I am a huge fan of third-party validation. In fact, the meeting I was in just before this was meeting with my team about the preliminary results of our current annual NIST assessment. We engage with a third party to do this every year. And I welcome that because it shows me the things we're doing right, and it shows me the gaps that we've got. As a board member, you should ask, is your enterprise using a NIST framework? Are you looking at something like a CAT tool? What are you looking at? And if the answer is, blank stares or a little bit of dancing around, you've got something to poke on a little bit.
Thanks, Joanna. And before I throw it over to our other two for some follow-up there, let me ask you one, because you are a CISO, and you would be the person responding to those board members' questions. Can you tell us a little bit about how the role of the CISO has evolved over time?
That is such a relevant and current topic, is what is the role of a CISO? As you mentioned my intro, Matt, I've been in cyber my whole career, but I've not actually been on the practitioner side for the majority. I spent the majority of my cyber career on the product side in security engineering, security research, product strategy. Put a foot over on the practitioner fence about 7 years ago. And turns out it was either great timing or terrible timing, depending how many hours you like to spend on your job. And what we have seen is for a long time, and as I mentioned earlier, this is oftentimes thought about as a technical silo. And it really not only has been thought about as a technical silo, but a very IT topic. It's even reflected in our titles. Most of us still have that title of CISO, information security. That just screams IT. But the evolution that has been taking place, and is, I think, a very needed evolution, is that's not enough. Cyber risk can touch a company in so many ways now. If you engage, many of you have seen the headlines in the last week about Okta. And I am not going to throw any stones at Okta here in this chat. We are all, Okta included, doing the best we can in a really difficult situation. But Okta is a company who offers a security service. They, like all of us enterprises, have a lot of third parties. One of their third-party customer support units was breached by an attacker. That was not a direct breach of Okta. No one got through their defenses directly, but the black eye on Okta has been really marked in the last week. I think the initial stock fall was somewhere around 15% when it became public. So even outside of your own IT infrastructure, the products and services that you offer, the partners that you do business with, the online habits of your senior executives, all of these things can bring cyber risk into your business. And you must now have CISOs in place who, number one, understand this is broader than just looking at vulnerabilities in IT systems. And the senior executives on the board of an enterprise also play a role here in making sure that that CISO's mandate is supported appropriately. They don't necessarily organizationally need to report to the CEO, but you have a role in making sure they have the platform that they need internally, that the right conversations are happening, and that people are appropriately looking at that scope as it's cybersecurity writ large, not just IT risk.
Thank you, Joanna. Joel, any follow on?
Just 2 points to follow up on Joanna's comments. One is back to third-party audit organizations. The information security staff at a company can become very comfortable with their 3PAO organizations and the outside experts that support them on a daily basis. And one of the ways that you can provide a little bit of disruption in that comfort level is to have yet another third party come in and do no notice inspections, and also provide timely advice and counsel on post-mortem activities associated with current breaches, like she just mentioned with respect to Okta, and how that may apply to your organization. It's human nature to get comfortable with the people we work with. I'm not suggesting that we don't have 3PAOs. We definitely need them. But some are so focused on compliance and getting ready for audit reports and reporting requirements, regulatory requirements, that sometimes we lose the signal for the noise when it comes to how do we deal with the lessons learned from a catastrophic breach that impacted market cap on and the investment and the outlay, the reputation and the business risk of a large enterprise. And so those are some key questions that ought to be addressed by board members, and having a little bit of a touch on, do we have no notice inspections, and do we have the ability to bring in outside experts that can advise us of relevant near-term breaches that affected large enterprises.
Thanks, Joel. And before we get to Kristen for some follow-up, everybody, please, if you have any kind of questions along the way, put them into the chat and we'll read them out as we go along. We're happy to make this as interactive as possible. This is an area where people have questions, so don't be shy, throw them up there. Kristen, any follow-up on Joanna and Joel?
No, I think they covered everything. I was just going to address the one question in the box about the FBI Academy, our CISO Academy. So this is something that we've been hosting since 2016. It's usually, I believe we were doing a spring and fall iteration at our FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. However, COVID changed that. And so the last iteration was this past fall, actually at our Charlotte field office. I believe the intention, and this is just my, what I think we're going to try to do is move it back to the Academy at some point, because just the logistics are there to make it a little bit easier and inviting. But what it essentially is exactly that. We invite CISOs from a variety of companies to be able to come for a multi-day discussion session where they can also discuss with other CISOs about events that have happened, what they've done, and how they've had to deal with those intrusion activities, as well as FBI. We provide threat briefings, and then there's also some other minor fun activities that occur at the FBI Academy to keep everybody engaged. If that's something that somebody is interested in, and this is going to be a theme that I'm going to kind of keep coming back to, your local field office, your local FBI personnel are going to be the best people to reach out to that, and they can keep you in the loop and make sure that we can bring as much information as possible on those events.
Okay, thanks. Joel, let's turn to you. I know we're constantly being warned about the threat actors out there and protecting our systems, but should our focus remain locked there on the inbound nature of the risk?
There's been a number of breaches over the past 18 months that have caused an awful lot of analysis in the cybersecurity industry and across enterprises around, are we doing enough, and are we prepared, and do we have enough early warning and understanding of emerging threats in a way that we can take meaningful action. And so if we just examine, I'm not going to call out any one particular breach, but if we examine some of the common lessons learned from SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, JBS Meatpacking, and the Microsoft breaches of the past 18 months, a couple of common threads have come out of that I think deserve board level attention. One of those is the ability for the adversary to have done detailed reconnaissance in the network that they ultimately attacked well before they exploited or took advantage of any vulnerability in the network itself. And so that detailed reconnaissance is something that can be seen if you have the right tools in place and have the right security protocols and inspection regimes and threat intelligence capabilities in your organization. But the lateral movement in each of those cases of the attacker's ability to not only gain an access point or an entry point into an enterprise network, but then to move very quickly across the network to reach intended targets, either inside the enterprise or downstream, was one of the most egregious concerns that came out of the lessons learned from these hacks. And so as you're thinking about what tools do I put in place or what capabilities do I have in an enterprise to try to understand how to be prepared for things like that, threat intelligence feeds and threat intelligence advisors are important, and most enterprises have those, and they have a very secure, a very mature security operations capability that involves a cyber threat intelligence team, and in some cases a red team, and in some cases a separate vulnerability analysis team that is separate from the security operations element that is looking at things like one-day vulnerabilities or zero-day vulnerabilities that could be impacting your network. But what we need is to truly understand that, do I have sensors in place and do I have capabilities in place in my enterprise to be able to stop lateral track or stop lateral movement? Very, very important question, hard question for CISOs and their staff to deal with, especially when you've already made some technology commitments and it's not time yet for a refresh or renewal of capabilities, but there are certain security protocols as well as tools that are fairly affordable that can provide you the right kind of sensing capability in the network from a technical perspective. From an organizational, human relations, culture, people perspective, one of the great lessons learned out of those attacks is mutual aid agreements. And so it's very important that you have your relationships with your information sharing advisory councils relevant to your industry sector, that you have an Infragard account with the FBI, that you have all the relevant information about threat actors coming into your network team, coming into your CISO team, but making sure you've got a relationship with your local FBI field office. And if you're in financial industry, your local Secret Service field office. And if you are in your local Department of Homeland Security field office that has with CISA. So CISA is becoming a much more mature, the critical infrastructure security agency is becoming much more mature, has local field offices now throughout the country that feed into kind of the federal national cybersecurity coordination center. And so it's very important for your security teams to have those kind of relationships and exercise those relationships and invite them in and get a company briefing and understand the telemetry of your network and understand how best to interact with you when an incident does occur. Something that's become pretty popular lately too, is the third takeaway, is mutual aid agreements with other corporations in your area. And so if your company is being hit, do you have experts that you can rely on and surge from other companies that have similar roles and have knowledge of your industry, have the NDAs in place, have the agreements set early, and so people from the outside expertise can quickly come in and surge when there's a challenge or when there's an incident. And that way you've got hands-on relevant experts that are familiar with your operating procedures, operate in a similar industry, and can help you in a time of crisis. The last point is with respect to downstream effects. You want me to cover that, Matt?
Please, please. Then we'll get to a couple of questions. We've just had a couple of timely questions pop up here.
When people are thinking about supply chain security, it's often from the perspective of the inbound supply chain. How is the company that I'm relying on as a vendor that's bringing me a service or a product, that's going to be integrated into our network from an IT perspective, how do I make sure that's secured and properly integrated in a way that I understand better how to secure the entire environment from an inbound perspective. Another key lesson from these breaches is that we also need to be thinking about supply chain security from the outbound perspective. So a new acquisition, a customer, a downstream partner that is a receiver of the information coming out of my network, the Okta example that Joanna brought up. Having a very good security plan with your downstream supply chain and customer base is critically important. Understanding how a breach in our network, our enterprise, could impact our customer base, our downstream partner base.
Thanks, Joel. Maybe just to go right to one of the questions. I think you've been talking on the topic specifically, but the question was, how does one determine if the company has the best state-of-the-art cybercrime prevention tools in place?
There is a great resource that you can use with the Infragard relationship with the FBI, and also with Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that are they have full-time labs constantly evaluating current technologies as well as new technologies, and can provide assessments and help you better understand, based upon your architecture, based upon your industry, based upon how your enterprise is designed, how many nodes you have, what current technologies you're using in your enterprise, is there something else that I should be considering? So there are government agencies that do this for a living that can offer assistance, or their information sharing partners can offer you assistance. And then of course there are very well-known consultants like the Mandiants of the world that can come in and provide you a security or vulnerability assessment, a technical analysis of your current enterprise that can help you gain an appreciation for, is there a gap? Is there something that I should be considering, even though it may be outside of my current IT spend cycle? Is there something that I can do in terms of a licensure, or not even necessarily a purchase or a contract that would be outside of your current budget outlay, but is there something I can do in terms of a licensure or just a partnership that would add value, add security value to my enterprise immediately?
Okay, thanks. Joanna, I know you'll have some follow-up on that, but while we're at this juncture, let me skip over to Kristen to address the other question that's come up, because I know you'll be talking about it. Kristen, can you discuss the role and services that the FBI can provide to a company? And while you're at it, address the concern, fear people have of contacting the FBI in the first place.
Sure thing. So one thing that we, when we talk about the different agencies, FBI and CISA in particular, we're there as the FBI. We're trying to investigate the crime that occurred on your network, and that is really our focus. I know there's some concern that calling the FBI in means they're going to start looking in other places, and what if there's some other activity that maybe we're concerned about or don't want the FBI looking for. We're focused on the crime that occurred on that network, and while some of also the TV shows makes it seem like every time the FBI is called in, we show in with a full-on SWAT team, helicopters, raid jackets. That's not the case in these instances.
And agents kick the local police out while they're at it, right?
Right.
They say, we've got it now, you're done.
Exactly. That's not the case, especially in cyber. I mean, our agents they're really well versed on kind of how to approach, and if we have a relationship with your company beforehand, we even might understand the sensitivities maybe of even say your corporate culture doesn't really have the suit mentality, and that might call attention. Our agents are pretty good at then coming in khakis or being able to blend in a way that's not going to call or cause you kind of consternation by coming to us. We're there to find these criminal activities, find these actors, to try to obtain as much information as we can to be able to then go further up the pipe chain and be able to obstruct them, ideally maybe lead to a prosecution, disrupt their activity. That's our focus. And so I know it could be a little kind of concerning about, again, what you see in the public. Having that relationship beforehand, either with your local field office, your local resident agency, and also working through things. I know Infragard was mentioned. That's one of our other kind of public outreach efforts where we have, you can become a member of Infragard, your company. We have regular meetings. There's about 80 chapters spread throughout the country. We have 56 field offices. So some offices have multiple chapters of Infragard where they bring in a variety of companies. You can talk here, you can get a feel for what might a response look like, what might a notification look like, and kind of get a better feeling for how that works out. We also do a lot of discussions early on with your legal teams, your general counsel, so that we can understand, what it might be, information your company would be willing to share initially, what might we be asking for, and again, just getting a better feel for what that cooperation, what that activity could look like if we do need to come, or if you need to call us in because of an incident.
Okay, thanks. And if anybody has contact information for Infragard, could we post it up there, Jen or Anna? I don't know if we have a link to them or a number we could give for people. That would really be helpful.
Sure, I'll add that.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. Joanna, follow up to either Joel or Kristen on that.
So as a practitioner who has worked with the FBI on topics, I do know there's a lot of FUD out there when you haven't done it, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I would strongly recommend, it's, and you can find via Infragard, and I know there's been a lot more, and I'm sure, Kristen and her colleagues can direct companies to this as well. It's a pretty well set amount of information that the FBI generally needs from you in order to be helpful in these cases. We are now starting to see that set of information, for example, log events from X period of time, that set of information is in the future, currently and in the future, not only going to get requested by the FBI, that set of information is now being requested by the SEC when they go in to investigate publicly traded companies that have had significant breaches. The SEC has begun to investigate publicly traded companies who might be using a vendor who had a breach. Many of us in the Fortune 500 got a long set of questions from the SEC last year about SolarWinds, for example. So every enterprise's cyber program should have some familiarity with, we call them the forensics generally. What are some of the forensics that I would need to provide in the case of a problem? And your company should have those anyway. It's so they can be used as an indicator of how can you think about being ready in advance, which folds into that preparedness element I mentioned earlier, but also should help make you a little bit more comfortable when it is time to work with a federal law enforcement agency in the case of a breach.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, and certainly there's been an evolution in that relationship. I remember back in the day as a lawyer going into some kind of fraudulent activity and trying to get the culprits nailed down, calling a federal authority. The number had to be really high before they could get interested, for a reason. They have limited resources. I think that this cybersecurity, a risk that we face is so large that the federal authorities have done such a great job of coming around to realizing we're all in this. Their issues are our issues and vice versa. The better we work together, the better we're going to be to defend against this.
And as a practitioner, I highly recommend that a company's CISO or whoever's most suited for it does keep that ongoing relationship with their assigned special agent in charge. That is a very fruitful, weekly or monthly exchange of information. And not only do both sides, in my experience, provide benefit to each other, because a lot of the same tactics are being used out there. A lot of the same attack groups are going after hundreds or thousands of enterprises. So even if there's a small amount of information to share, it can be part of a broader whole that really does help, number one, try to prevent these activities, but maybe even ultimately bring some of them to justice. That exchange as well does help, I think, break down some of that FUD as well. So you've already got a relationship before you're in the position to really, really need one.
No doubt. Right. Kristen, if you could switch topic just a little bit. In this agonizing time with the U.S. engaged in a proxy war with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it almost feels like it's too quiet. We've been warned that there's something afoot, that we need to be on high alert. What can you tell us about the nation and non-state activity that's out there in today's world?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting time. Over the last several years, really, we've been seeing this evolution across the board. As Joanna just mentioned, a lot of the actors are using the same tactics. And so we're seeing much more of a blending of how they're gaining access. And unfortunately, what we're seeing both nation state and non-nation state actors doing is using a lot of low cost, low resource intensive tactics on their side that enables them to not only gain access to our company's networks, but maintain that access and essentially hide into that normal network activity. And so where it is quiet in terms of them maybe actioning that activity, we have high concerns that they are a variety of actors, could already be in our networks and are just hiding into plain sight. Because unfortunately, none of these actors are dumb. For us, that would be great, right? But they understand our playbook. They know how networks are typically defended. And so they know that if they aren't using things like spearfish campaigns or malware that's going to be detected by antivirus, and instead, if they can exploit either public vulnerabilities that are going to be publicized to the world, and that depending on the company's ability or timing of their patching, it's going to leave an open door, an open window that they can very easily gain access to. We've also see the actors very much rely on the exploitations of inconsistent network security practices. So we all know some of the best practices that we should be doing, and for a variety of reasons, perhaps there's some interoperability issues on our networks, or proprietary issues, or we can't take parts of the network down to do certain things. But the actors are aware of that, and so they'll know, if everybody, say in a company, has multi-factor authentication, that two-factor, maybe a token or something extra than just the username and password, with the exception of maybe the CEO, or say the finance department, or some exception, that becomes the target of these actors. And when we look at how big the networks are, generally speaking, they're pretty good at finding those exceptions. And so one thing kind of we want to at least highlight is that re-examining whenever there is a network security practice exemption that's given, either a system that can't be patched, again, for maybe a legitimate business reason, then looking at if that absolutely needs to occur, can it be isolated from the other parts of the network? So you're reducing, back to especially Joanna's earlier comment, you're reducing that risk to the whole part of the network. If we can start isolating things and making it a little more defensible, it's going to make it harder for the actors to more easily gain access, and ideally put us in a better position to hopefully completely mitigate the activity, but at least maybe be able to detect that activity a little bit sooner. We're seeing these actors exploit legitimate connections, especially between third-party services, the managed service providers, cloud providers, anything that's going to have that dedicated line that's maybe inherently trusted into the network, especially if it's single-factor authenticated, just that username or password. We see the actors exploiting that. The managed service provider intrusion case back in 2018, where we indicted some Chinese actors, is a pretty good example of that. For several years, these actors were in the managed service provider using their connections to their client networks to gain access to those client networks. They are hiding into that activity that's paid for between the client and the MSP. And that's what we're seeing a lot of the actors go to, is just finding things that are normal on the network and hiding in within that. And so if the network security fences is just signature based, using things that we know are bad, bad malware files, bad IP addresses, bad domains, things that we call indicators of compromise, and not looking at the behavior of an account, it's going to miss a lot of this activity. And what I mean by that behavioral account, if we understand what a normal user activity looks like on the network, and we can detect anomalous activity off of that, that's how we're going to find some more of these actors. And that is something that is really exclusively in the hands of the network owners. We, as the FBI, we don't see, into the private networks, and so we are much more reliant on the network owners to identify that activity and then be able to report it back to us or to CISA to help us understand the scope and scale, so we could maybe start illuminating some of what's actually going on out there and get a better feel for where these actors already have their access, what might they be positioning to doing, what might they be laying in wait to be able to execute.
Thanks, Kristen. To take a question from the audience right on this, are attackers targeting a specific company? Do they stay after it regardless of the defenses put in place, or are they just exploiting weaknesses that they find? We hear in home security, as long as you make it a little bit more difficult than the neighbor down the street, you're going to do yourself a favor there. Is that the case here?
We unfortunately, we're going to see both. So we're going to have the actors who, especially a nation state actor who maybe is very well resourced, and their goal is to get at a technology or an access that a company makes. They're absolutely going to be focused on gaining access to that company. But we also then do see the ones who are just looking to gain access, especially if we're talking maybe critical infrastructure at large and wanting just to be able to pre-position their access to cause a disruption. It might not matter specifically which company or which critical infrastructure sector, just getting access and being able to execute something might be enough. And so we do see both. We also see kind of just widespread scanning, especially when a vulnerability is publicized, we think to help add to, well, how can we get into that network a little bit easier if they have this vulnerability? Is that become then a targeted access? They've been waiting for, say, company X to have a vulnerability. They find one and now they can go after it. Or are they going to go after the 20 or 50 or 30 companies that they have this vulnerability? So it's unfortunately going to be both, especially depending on the motive of that actor.
Thanks. I don't know how we're doing on time. Yes?
Matt, I'm going to pop in there and say we see a hybrid too of this now a little bit with what we're calling the I call it the one-to-many attack. But this is where, and I mentioned SolarWinds earlier. I know everyone saw the headlines around SolarWinds 2 years ago. We saw headlines around a company called Kaseya last year. This was a very similar situation where attackers, as Kristen mentioned earlier, unfortunately, they're smart. And they're not only intelligence smart, they're business smart as well. And they're constantly improving their operations and they're getting more efficient. They have really gotten a lot more efficient at realizing, I don't need to tackle one victim. I can go after a commonality that unites thousands of victims. And if I attack that commonality, then I can choose from thousands of enterprises or entities to exploit. This is what happened with SolarWinds, where the attacker, they might have had their eye on a small set of commonly used IT software, but they ultimately got into SolarWinds. And by doing so, they were then able to touch, I think it was 18,000 entities that used SolarWinds software and services. So we're sort of seeing a little bit of that blend where, hey, we're going to laser focus after a certain commonality. And then we're going to use that to either broad scale attack or to really cherry pick who we're interested in. And that evolution of, this one-to-one attacker to victim, we're seeing more and more now of that one-to-many.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions that I want to try to get to. Maybe we can do some rapid fire, although the first one probably is going to take a little bit of thought and consideration, but it kind of follows on the whole consideration of taking this. What board members need to consider is to take probably a more multidisciplinary approach, right? That this is risk generally. Start from that, work into the IT issues in particular. And the question asked is, does a cyber attack originally manifest itself as an IT issue or as an operational issue? And if the latter, then can you discuss alternate types of monitoring or efforts that the firms might consider or sensitivities that the board might have about it? Any of you?
So I'll jump in just really quickly, and if anyone wants to add to it, it could be both. I think it's going to depend on what you see. And so usually for the cyber attack, targeting an OT network might want to be able to disrupt that OT environment. But in a lot of cases, they probably have to go through your IT to get to the OT, and might have and leave some traces there. Or as we saw in the case of Colonial, not necessarily even having to go after the direct OT, can still cause the effect that's interested. And so I think it's more likely to be that OT environment, but it still could be the IT part.
Okay.
And this is where, there are additional monitoring tools that you can use with that awareness. Like, hey, I may see something in my OT environment, or, but this is really where the people element is a very important one. And, a lot of cyber training and employee awareness now concentrates on, are you seeing anything unusual? Did you get is there a certain business process that you're used to following to issue accounts payable notifications? And is there a blip in that process? Did someone ask in an odd way to have their bank account details changed? This is where the whole, if you see something, say something comes up, because the early indicators of an attack may very well be things that manifest as just something odd to somebody. And secondly, you really want to make sure that, especially in larger, more complex enterprises, which really can mean anything over a couple of hundred people, make sure your processes in the enterprise are linked with each other appropriately. If there is a priority 1 or priority 0 MI, major incident, that occurs in your IT department, make sure your cyber department knows about it. It might have a cyber element to it. It may not. It may just be a server that went offline because it was old. But similarly, if someone in finance is uncovering something that is an incident to them, they've uncovered a control that didn't work right. These groups need to be talking to each other, because it all comes down to business continuity. And if your various stakeholders in the enterprise aren't speaking to each other when unusual things happen, that's when a cyber event can quickly move from containable to completely uncontainable.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. Thinking about it operationally includes having everyone in your organization being able to hit a button that says suspicious email. Somebody check it out, right? That's threat intelligence.
Mhm.
That's and that takes somebody to act on it. For any of you, how do you think about the CISO CIO relationship, and whether or not there should be a direct reporting relationship? Maybe we can hit that with a quick answer. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Quick answer, there's no right answer.
Okay, Joe?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to Joanna's point that she just made, which is, maybe enterprise risk is the better term to be using, as opposed to just saying information security staff or information. It's all related. And in large enterprises, and again, you're right, it can be defined as anything over a couple hundred people these days, just given the complexity of the global network and how we all interact. We need to have somebody at the board level, but certainly at the executive level of companies, focus on enterprise risk and making sure that all those elements are connected. It's not just a cyber issue; it's across the board. There's behind every stroke of a keyboard is a human, and so the human threat intelligence function in a company, which you don't usually see until you get to the very large enterprise level, is really important too.
Okay, thanks. Let's hit another one. Maybe Kristen, in the globalized workforce environment where data centers are in multiple countries and applications are in hybrid, data center here, cloud environment there, how can the U.S. government agencies help? Do we have jurisdictional issues?
So yes, with all of the different places, one thing we would at least stress is to see if you can keep your data here in the U.S., where it's going to be only bound by U.S. laws. That's going to be great. If you're using data centers or companies in places, and I'm going to focus on China for one, that's my background, and two great examples there, unfortunately, where China's putting laws into place that gives them legal access to any data that they basically want from any of their companies, either that is residing in China, or companies that are even external are also bound by the Chinese laws. And this goes even as far as for things like vulnerability identification. China has laws where if you find a vulnerability in a particular software or technology, you have to report it to the Chinese government, not to the vendor to fix, to the Chinese government, as well as if there's 0-day vulnerabilities, those unknown ones, again, not to the vendor, you got to tell the Chinese government first. And so in addition to, just the inherent issues or concerns we would have with privacy, knowing where your data is and what that might be falling under, if it goes outside, and especially in a place like China, they could have a lot more access than we ever could here. They're not bound by our legal process. They're not bound by restrictions. We are bound by the Constitution, and we follow that. And so the privacy is a lot better here. So wherever possible, at least if your data can't be completely contained here locally in the US, then maybe being able to isolate it, encrypt it, do whatever you can to protect it wherever it needs to go, and understanding not only the privacy laws in China, but there's GDPR in the EU and other things at play that might come into effect depending on what data is in what places.
Didn't in fact the last year's China's data law declare that strategic information that they deem data they deemed strategic is owned in fact by them.
Yes, and they love to throw out these kind of vague definitions that when you go to push on what does strategic mean, it's well, we know what it means. You don't need to know. We're good.
Right.
And they leave it inherently vague so they can kind of apply it however they see fit.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts, anyone on the new cyber scorecard services that are being sold to boards as an indicator of an organization's cyber profile?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from the colleagues in here, their point of view on this as well. I'm mixed on these. And one of the reasons I'm mixed is, number one, the theory and the idea is good, and the reality is they're never going away. People love easy answers. Everyone wants easy answers in everything. And so the idea of, hey, this company can run a remote scan and they can give me a scorecard of a certain enterprise, and I have the single answer to how resilient is this enterprise from a cyber perspective. That's very compelling because everyone wants easy. That's also my argument with these services, is it's never a black and white answer, and the way that a lot of these services work, without getting too terribly technical about them, is they'll do remote scanning of an IP space, and IP space registration information is a disaster. Like, it's just a disaster. So you take very large companies or companies who've done a lot of M&A activity in any direction. When you think you're scanning their IP space, you're not really. You're going to be scanning the space of a lot of other people, or you're going to miss something that actually is in their space. So I struggle a little bit with how reductionist it is, but I advise people, you cannot ignore it. You must be aware of what these reports are saying about an enterprise. You must be aware that customers are going to look at these reports and look at it as a risk or a comfort of doing business with your enterprise, so they cannot be ignored.
Good thought. Yeah. Let's see. What is being done to go after ransomware as a service actors? These actors seem to provide tools and infrastructure to enable a larger number of bad actors.
For really any of the criminal actor groups, we have a lot of efforts to try to disrupt. Back in the days, it was a lot more just focused on the botnets, and so now it is on the ransomware piece. And we are looking at different legal, technical disruption ways to be able to try to target them. There's issues, right? There's a lot of them. They're pretty well versed, and a lot of them, they're not located here in the US. So getting our hands on them is a little tricky, but there's definitely things that we are trying to do to disrupt them as much as possible. This is one of the reasons why, and obviously this is a business decision, but our position is not to pay for the ransomware. Again, business decision, and so we understand that you have to make what makes the most sense for you, but the money that keeps going to them keeps helping to fund these resources, which just makes it harder to be able to disrupt as they keep finding these very lucrative ways to kind of keep increasing their cash flow and increasing their presence.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about Zoom. Zoom has apparently the Chinese has some ownership interest in Zoom.
Yeah, the founder of Zoom he's a Chinese American citizen, and there was some issues early on in the pandemic when some traffic seemed to be routed through China. At least it was publicly put out there, and some encryption keys were kept on servers in China, and so the concern was why is that happening? and this is kind of just going back to our concerns with Chinese companies, even ones that are founded here, if they're doing business at all in China, are going to be bound by those laws. And so it's not necessarily, we as US government and as the FBI, this is not an issue with Chinese people. This is the Chinese government that we're trying to defeat. And so we're trying to put things in place here to protect Chinese companies here, working within our legal restrictions, and then keeping the long arm of China from being interfering with them. And so I don't think there's anything that really puts Zoom as well as other unencrypted platforms are going to be all at that same level of risk. But there was at least some public reporting early on that there was some interesting activity occurring that probably should not have been.
Okay, maybe Joel on this one. Could you please comment on steps boards might take or questions they might ask to ensure there's a level of resilience, especially after there's an attack?
This is the time of year where you see the annual threat reports come out from previous years' cyber attacks, and Verizon is probably one of the more respected and well put together reports that you can read. And not surprisingly, findings from the past year are pretty similar to the previous 5 years in terms of stolen and lost credentials are really responsible for about 80% of the attacks that occur. And so going back to the points that Kristen and Joanna have made, multi-factor authentication is extremely important. If you have the resourcing ability to do account takeover prevention and have an ATP tool as well, that's also very important. There are companies out there now that actually specialize in how to remediate against the stolen and lost credentials. Given the human transition turnover and jobs, there's in the way the stolen and missing and lost credentials are handled on the darknet. There are just so many active accounts out there that are still able to be exploited, and so making sure that you're protecting against that is very important. Joanna may pat me on the back later for this comment, but we also know from these reports that basic hygiene is incredibly important, and people just yawn at that when they hear it. But security hygiene, especially in vulnerability management, patch management, is critically important. And so if a board member were to ask a question, let me see the metrics and the details around your patch management program, that's a fantastic question to ask. It's definitely in the weeds. A lot of operators and executives would think that maybe that's inappropriate for a board member to ask, but just asking that question in a meeting is going to get a whole bunch of activity generated to answer that question, and then you will be surprised at what you see. Companies are sometimes not months, years behind in their patch management, and most of the attacks that occur are taking advantage of unpatched vulnerabilities. And so if you can, there's plenty of programs out there that Chris and Art has already talked about to identify vulnerabilities that are publicly known, and just patching those and making sure that you've mitigated those properly. There's one thing to patch, there's another thing to make sure you've got the right mitigations in place, and having both of those checked and certified by your security team is critically important. Sorry, long answer, but
no, thanks. That reminds me, look, we're now in a day and age where employees want to work remotely. I don't think it's going away ever. How do we effectively incorporate that without sacrificing cybersecurity? Anybody?
I will pipe up because I'm going to take Joel's answer and make it a tiny bit longer as well, because it is such a good one. This question about how can I have comfort in the resilience or not? There are so many, sadly, there have been so many opportunities for case studies that there are some great case studies out there. After the breach that took Maersk down for so long, Maersk did an amazing job at getting out and being very vocal about what augmented and exacerbated their problem and what they would have done differently. In fact, the MERS case really led to a resurgence in people focusing on having offline or air-gapped backups in this age of the cloud. That was something that had kind of fallen off a little bit. So I advise, and I think it is a great request for any board member to say, look, can we as an enterprise and a board take a case study and go through how would this have played out at our enterprise? And I think that's a great activity because it can help with some of that preparedness that we've been talking about, but it can also really give you the chance to hear from the enterprise that you're serving, where is their resilience strong and where does it seem that there may be some weak points to poke on there? I think the changes in the way of working are going to highlight some of those weak points. For example, there's a lot of companies now who want to figure out how do you take advantage of the gig worker economy to offer customer service capabilities, for example. Think about that on the surface. It's kind of like, wow, that's serious. I'm going to take employee credentials, give them to a temporary worker who may work 1 hour a day and then go hold 9 other jobs somewhere else. How do I make sure I do that in a secure way? I think we have to look at the changes of the ways of working folded into that broader strategy. And I advise it's a great time to zoom out on any enterprise's cyber strategy. And keep in mind, fundamentally, there's not a one size fits all for anybody. There's not a checklist for anybody. What really matters is, do you know what makes your company special? Are you protecting that value prop appropriately? Do you know and can you articulate and are you all aligned on your risk appetite? And third, how does your current cyber posture intersect with the changing threat and working landscape? Zoom out and look at those things occasionally. Like Joe mentioned earlier, people get comfortable with their third parties. They get comfortable with their partners. They don't scrutinize them anymore. It's really great to take that step back and scrutinize, is the way people are working today folding into my strategy? Are my partners still serving my strategy? You know, it can be easy to not do this because of the tyranny of the urgent over the important, but I think that zoom out is super important.
Yes. Okay, some shorter questions. Credentials. Is some type of MFA better than another?
Yes.
Please.
Yes, at least, and please jump in. I mean, we've seen, so here's the thing with technology, right? There's always going to be a vulnerability in something at some point. Nothing is going to be 100% foolproof. However, and then you do have that human element. If some MFA is used exactly how it should be used, it's a lot stronger than when it's used incorrectly. And so what I mean by that is if you're using a card and you leave it in the reader all night, longer than it's supposed to be. You know, if you're logged in longer than it's supposed to be, if things don't have timeouts to kind of force that reauthorization less secure. Hard tokens, at least we think are likely going to be a little more secure than soft tokens or one-time passwords, things that could more easily maybe be fabricated or take advantage of. I think it was in the Lapsus case recently where the multi-factor didn't have a timeout for how many requests could be made to try to authenticate. And so there was a rush of the one-time passwords coming out to where in the middle of the night to where some employees were just trying to make it quiet, thought it was a technical glitch. And by enabling that, it allowed that access. And so what we've seen at least is when we have yet to identify the compromise of the solution. It tends to be more that the solution wasn't put in place or that there was some kind of configuration issue that allows the actors to bypass that or take advantage of it not being as secure as it could be. But that being said, it's at least at another level that the actors are going to have to try to find another way in. And so it does at least impede, in some cases, maybe stop some actors who don't have the technical capabilities or aren't well resourced, but in other cases, at least slow some of them down to try to have to find a way to bypass that.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Do you recommend password protection services like Dashlane, say at the corporate level even, to protect and complicate credential loss?
Account takeover prevention solutions are very important, more so than password protection. So understanding that if you do have a lost or stolen credential that's being used in the wild, but also have the ability to be able to constantly scan your own network for stolen or lost credentials that may be used against your network is very important as well. So a more holistic solution than just password protection solutions is important. Also, Wayne brought up a really good point in the chat. We were talking multi-factor authentication, but a multi-factor authentication, in addition to a hard token and automatic timeout that Kristen mentioned, is one that uses FIDO2, is very important as well. So those kind of three elements together: hard token, FIDO2, and then timeouts are pretty critical to a good multi-factor authentication solution.
Okay. We haven't really touched on cyber insurance. It's a topic in and of itself that could take hours. But in terms of knowing what you have, you know, we can't stress that enough to make sure what's out there. But you know, how much are we seeing that change these days?
There's been a huge amount of churn in this space, and I don't think we've seen the end of the churn. Especially in the last 2 years, practitioners, you know, anyone applying or renewing a policy has seen premiums increasing anywhere from 30% to 350% is kind of the range I've been hearing. And generally that premium increase is coupled with a decline in coverage and a decline in SLAs. I think the insurance industry is starting to realize that the coverage was overly broad for a period of time. I believe we're going to move to a period where we see more limited, more specific type policies. I don't believe we're at the end of seeing the churn here. I recommend be thoughtful about whether your enterprise has insurance or not, about whether you should. As a board director, you definitely should know. Do you have it? What are you paying to get it? And what are the broad terms of the coverage? It may or may not be worth it.
Thanks, Joanna. Okay, I think we are at the wrap-up point. So I'd like to ask you all to, you know, give us your best takeaways in a few minutes each. And why don't we start in reverse? We'll start with Kristen.
Sorry. So I think, you know, everything that we've just been saying in terms of, you know, looking at as much as you can, just asking questions. I think there's a little bit of was kind of acknowledged, you know, sometimes cyber is looked at as this extremely technical, hard to understand kind of thing. And so it's put off to the side, when in reality, I think it should be permeating, especially as Joanna was commenting, much more of kind of our everyday conversation. We need to kind of start changing the mindset that it's not just the IT problem, it's going to be a problem for the entire company. And for the entire, really even beyond that, larger to society. There was a comment made about people working from home, and people working from home might think, you know, I don't really need to worry about cybersecurity. That's in the corporate environment part, but now they're connecting from unsecure networks and much more at risk. And so we just need to kind of broaden our understanding of that and really never being complacent, even if the big cyber event hasn't occurred yet. Doesn't mean that it's not. Doesn't mean that it's not waiting. With all their different threat actors out there, it's really kind of a mindset of changing it, of trying to just kind of be constantly vigilant and looking for different ways that we could minimize the threat and minimize the risk.
Thanks, Kristen. Joel?
3 takeaways for the group here: patch management. Make sure you do it often, make sure it's current, and try to get the identified vulnerability and the patch timeline reduced as much as possible. Second point, implement a multi-factor authentication solution immediately. And the third is bring in a third-party cyber risk advisor that is not part of your comfort zone, and have them do a vulnerability assessment of your team and of the enterprise. And if you're feeling sporty for a day, have them do with your at the tactical level a no-notice exercise. Very, very helpful. People will do what they're inspected for.
Always, especially when they know in advance what it's all going to entail, right?
That's right.
Yep. Thanks, Joel. Joanna?
I'd like to leave with this thought, which is a little bit more medium and longer term looking. I think, and I hope, we're going to start talking about cyber more as a key element of the G in ESG. Fundamentally, good cyber practice is good corporate governance. Full stop. And I think if we think about it that way, we don't think of it as an IT problem. We don't think about it as a product security problem. We think about it as a piece of good corporate governance. Framing it that way can really help lead enterprises and boards to making the right decisions.
Thank you. And thank you to NACD for this wonderful opportunity to present these three. Anna, turn it over to you.
Actually, I think Jen's going to close.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt. Excellent job. Thank you so much, Joel, Joanna, and Kristen. So many great takeaways from this conversation. We so appreciate you sharing your insights with us. Thank you all who attended the program. We would love your feedback, and Becky has put a link to our survey in the chat. We'll also send it afterwards in an email. So in the interest of continuous improvement, we would love your feedback. And just a reminder, Anna mentioned it in the beginning, but NAC does have an NACD cyber certificate course. If you're interested in that certification and learning more, there's a link in the chat for that as well. And then finally, I invite you to join us, those of you who are in Houston, and even if you want to travel to Houston, for our April 19th in-person program with Secretary James Baker on the state of the world today. That should be an outstanding conversation. So with that, we will leave you for today, but we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.